the simple question I really want us to get at today is, how did we get here? You know, why I'm so thrilled that we're sitting here at the business school as an MBA is because it matters that we think about the role that corporations play in society and what responsibility do they have to us, whether we are ratepayers or residents of a community that might be, you know, particularly exposed to fire issues. It all matters. And so we're going to talk about how we got here, and then the second panel is going to be more focused on what comes next. I'm so thrilled to have Will Abrams, Katherine Blunt, and Michael Picker with me here today. Katherine just wrote a fantastic book called California Burning, which is an excellent account, a very thorough account of the history of PG&E, a Pacific Gas and Electric Company. And in her spare time, she's also an energy reporter at the Wall Street Journal, where she was part of team coverage that won the Gerald Loeb Award, which is the highest honor in financial journalism. She's also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And so much of her book talks about the answers to this question of how did we get here. So really thrilled to have Katherine here. Sitting next to me is Will Abrams, who plays a starring role in Katherine's book. Will is a 2017 Tubbs fire survivor. He is, you might have seen him in various news articles, or if you read the book, you're probably very familiar with his story. Fled the flames of the Tubbs fire with his wife and his 2 kids. Their house did not survive, and that fire, fair to say, really changed the trajectory of Will's life. I mean, today, he is someone you'll see, if not in bankruptcy court, you'll see him at the CPUC, you know, asking important questions of all manner of people who are involved in the energy space, including sometimes PG&E executives really holding their feet to the fire, and I think we're all better for it. And I've learned so much from Will. I mean, he is somebody who has come at this from the many different spaces that this story is really about, which is the regulatory side, the political side, the legal side. And at the end of it all, this is really a human story. This is a story about people and people who live in communities and who are vulnerable to these very important and very scary issues. So I'm so glad that Will is here as well. And Michael Picker, last but not least. I just introduced you last because you're all the way over there. But he, you're probably very familiar in some cases with Michael. He was the president of the California Public Utilities Commission from 2014 to 2019, is currently a partner at Caliber Strategies. The job at the CPUC, Michael has said in the past, he did not enjoy very much. And we're going to talk about that today and why that was, what he learned, and how we can do this better. So a round of applause, if you don't mind, for our fantastic panel. So when PG&E first filed for bankruptcy, well, the second time, in 2019, I remember seeing this headline. I think it was Bloomberg News, and it was like, the world's first climate change bankruptcy. And I kind of had mixed feelings about that, because on the one hand, this bankruptcy had been very much driven by climate change, right? The company had just come off of 4 years of having its equipment spark fire. So 2015, 2017, and 2018, they are now facing tens of billions of dollars in liabilities, and then they choose to go into Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection for the second time in their history. So climate change, yes, that helped drive these fires, but there was so much that came before, you know, the real impacts of climate change set in. And by the way, a lot of this is discussed in Katherine's book, so you should get it, you should read it. But Katherine, I wanted to start with you about that whole notion of the first climate change bankruptcy and how climate change has really been a part of this discussion, because you can kind of use it as an excuse, right? But there was a lot of other stuff that preceded it. So how do you look at the history of PG&E in the context of, well, how did we get to this point?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And it's funny that you bring up that article, because I think it was actually the Journal.
Oh, it was the
my
Journal.
colleague Russell who wrote it, and we had that exact conversation.
Okay.
Like, I was like coming up with that sort of headline, and there was that same sort of pushback when that piece came out, being like, yes, but, right? And at the time, we were really grappling with the enormity of the bankruptcy, the fact that these fires were so destructive in large part because tens of millions of trees had died after periods of severe drought made worse by climate change. And as we continued with our reporting, we started grappling with these much larger questions of okay, yes, this was a huge factor, but there's a lot that needs to be discussed alongside of it.
Yeah.
And I think that, I often tell people to really understand the story of what happened to PG&E. You need to have some understanding of 100 years of history, because the component on the transmission line that failed and ultimately ignited the campfire, which just killed 84 people in 2018, was original equipment. It was 100 years old, and it hadn't been replaced. It had been hanging there, wearing down little by little with every windstorm for a very long time. But really, you need to have a close understanding of 20 years of history as to really sort of when things started to break down for this company, in part because, Lily mentioned that this is indeed PG&E's second bankruptcy. Its first bankruptcy came after the California energy crisis of 2001. And when the company emerged from that bankruptcy, one of the dynamics that played out was that it was very intent on reestablishing itself with Wall Street and pleasing shareholders. There was a drive to grow earnings, and it was discovered later on that did come at the expense of certain safety investments and safety spending that should have been done to maintain the health of the infrastructure. They ultimately sort of addressed it on the gas side after a devastating natural gas pipeline explosion in San Bruno in 2010, but the electric division didn't get the same amount of attention. There was other things that was somewhat distracting or challenging for the company during this time, but as all of this is playing out, the climate is changing, making the risk of infrastructure failure higher, but it is certainly not the reason that the infrastructure failed. So we can certainly delve into that.
Okay, so Will, you and I met in 2019 at a CPUC workshop. I think I actually met you and Michael on the same day. And I remember it well. You were asking a question, and then, fast forward a couple months, I remember you asking this question. I was like, I need to talk to that person. I immediately made a beeline for you and got your phone number, and we ended up staying in touch after that. But fast forward a couple of months, and you're actually asking the questions of some of the people that are coming before the CPUC. And ultimately, towards the end of the PG&E bankruptcy, you are grilling PG&E executives about some really important aspects of the bankruptcy. What kind of financial state was the company going to be in when this was all over? And there were plenty of other people that could have been asking those questions, but it was this guy from Sonoma County, who was asking the tough questions, as is documented in Katherine's book. And I wonder, of course, having a tragedy like this, happen to you is going to impact you. But why do you think it is that you ended up taking this to such a level where you are in the bankruptcy court one day, in the CPUC another day, filing these briefs, teaching yourself how to even write a bankruptcy legal brief? How did that happen?
So it was very personal for me. When you are running for safety with your kids and your family, and before that time, I had looked at corporate responsibility as sort of something I focused on during the day at work, and left there. And this really brought viscerally home to me that corporate responsibility affects us all in lots of different ways. So then the question coming out of that was, given my skill set, where can I go to help? Where can I contribute? And, so then you sort of do that transferable skill analysis about where you can contribute. And sort of that led me to focus locally at recovery and resiliency efforts. And from there, because I had worked at different nonprofits serving people with disabilities, got involved in the public safety power shutoffs and those proceedings where it is affecting people with disabilities in very specific ways, and sort of got exposed to the Public Utilities Commission and grew to respect the Public Utilities Commission in terms of a process that you can follow.
Yeah, you like that about the CPUC. We've talked about this where there's a rubric here, and there's a record being kept at the CPUC.
Yeah, and this is very different than sort of other spaces, right? So part of trying to figure out where you can advocate is how do you go about this, right? And so in Sacramento, as an example, it's so who can I speak to? Where can I make an influence? What hearing room should I show up in? But with the Public Utilities Commission, because there are rules, there are specifics about, start with A, dot your I's and cross your T's with your papers in this way, and then, decisions are made. And so all of that for me was really a relief that there was, a structure to follow to contribute. And there was a structure to follow to collaborate, right? And this is the thing with talking about these large issues of climate change and corporate governance and how we're all going to come together. What is that process? What is the process for coming together? And so it was refreshing coming into the Public Utilities Commission and seeing a structure for the collaboration. And we'll get into in a little bit all the challenges associated with that, but that was really what drove me to the Public Utilities Commission and then to the bankruptcy proceeding where there were different structures.
Michael, I want to talk to you about sort of the CPUC as an organization. I mean, we were all looking to the CPUC, to fix this, right? And it became pretty clear that, there were a lot of constraints on what the CPUC could do. I mean, fines being a big one, and you have to wonder sometimes, how big a fine is enough to finally kind of whip PG&E into shape. And I think, when you step back, the question I have, and I think probably a question a lot of people have, is the CPUC equipped to, and was it equipped at the time to regulate PG&E the way it needed to?
This is a question I asked myself the whole time I was there, and I continue to ask it, and I still don't have really good answers. But before I go any further, I want to call out Carolyn Jacobs-Smith, who was actually the person who's inherited the Wildfire Safety Division at the CPUC. She built it from the ground up. She's now over at the Resources Agency. So probably you should ask her in a couple of years whether she thinks she can fix it. Because she's going to be on the ground. Mm-hmm. And as a commissioner, your job is to balance. You don't fix things. You pick the point where there's a balance. So the whole time, I kept asking myself things like, is an economic regulator the place where you really get at safety? Our job was to allow the utility to adequately charge for the infrastructure that they were putting in place. We did that in the context of standards that for many years actually came from outside of the CPUC. So if conditions change and those standards no longer are valuable, how is it that people at the CPUC, who are largely economists, sometimes accountants, I think we needed more accountants, sometimes engineers, I think we needed more engineers, but lawyers, economists, and process people. Is that the best way to deal with emergent risk? And if you have more fuels, if you have more population that's moving into those wildfire hazard areas, and you're required to enforce the access rules to the essential infrastructure that cause the utilities to build more infrastructure into those wildfire hazard areas, is that the right process to deal with these emergent risks? 50% of all new housing in California between 2010 and 2020 is in areas that we later recognized to be in hazardous or extremely hazardous wildfire areas. Every one of those distribution lines is required by law to go into places that the CPUC does not decide is safe. We don't know anything about fires. We don't know anything about fuels. We have to hire CAL FIRE to do that for us. We have one person who lived with them at that time. He spent a lot of time talking to firefighters. He knew a lot. But when it comes to the commissioners to make a decision through that process that Will likes, is it really the place where you can address all these things? In another wildfire case, we spent months hearing about different wind modeling from different parties, the San Diego Witch, Wahito, and Rice Fire. And it was clear that in one model, the wind speeds were higher than the equipment was ever intended to be manufactured for. The standards didn't work. Was this a one-time event? Should the utility have known and prepared for that before? That's a hard judgment to make, but you have to balance. And the evidence, what you do is you balance who's presented the best evidence. Here, we never had that discussion of what is truly the role of the CPUC.
Was it to you that the CPUC is responsible for too many things? I mean, it's a big agency. Is it, 1,000 people?
Well, when I came there, I kind of recognized that the CPUC did a lot of things that probably were not monopolies, that were not essential services. We oversaw hot air balloons, general aviation airports, ferries. I never quite got comfortable with the idea that we regulated Lyft and Uber. I understand why they liked it. But does that make sense that we spend our time on these issues? There are a lot of big issues that we have to deal with. Each commissioner carried between 40 and 60 cases at any time, which meant that you didn't get to actually dig into these larger questions as to the role of the CPUC and how to balance. Commissioner Guzman and Aceves and I asked this question about how do we deal with the fact that all the situations that we used to have answers to, that we could answer in an economic regulator body, they don't apply anymore. How do we then stay ahead of this? What do we do with climate change? If we all believe in climate change, things are different. Are the decisions that we've made for the last 100 years still true?
Katherine, what was your sense of the CPUC's role, what they could have done that maybe they didn't?
Sure. Well, I think something that is notable and is sort of striking to me in talking to different people who've worked in the PUC over the years is that, well, of course, like there is just the very true fact, as Michael just said, that the PUC has, a lot of functions, and in general, I think a number of people in different areas of the agency were probably stretched too thin. But one thing that is notable is that around the time PG&E emerged from its first bankruptcy, 2004, 2005 timeframe, California began setting some really ambitious targets for renewable energy procurement. And of course, there's a positive side of this story in that this, in pushing each of California's large utilities to procure a lot of wind and solar power, those early contracts, helped drive down costs, have made wind and solar really competitive forms of generation today. But I mean, the early contracts were expensive, they were complicated. But if you worked within the PUC, that was definitely sort of an area in which you wanted to work, had the most cachet. It made people excited.
Michael's nodding his head vigorously over there.
And meanwhile, it was much harder to effectively staff the safety division. It was kind of chronically short of resources, short of people, hard to keep people in those roles because industry jobs paid better. And so, I think it was very difficult for the PUC for a long time and now to have really good oversight of not only PG&E, but also the state's other utilities, which of course they have to regulate. So, big challenge.
I'm really interested in the legislation that was passed and signed by Governor Newsom I think it was July of 2019, AB 1054, which set up a wildfire fund for the state's investor-owned utilities, not just PG&E, but also SDG&E in San Diego and SoCal Edison. And I wonder, Katherine, if you can just lay out your understanding of how that legislation came to be, because it became very important in the bankruptcy proceeding, it set a deadline for PG&E to be out of bankruptcy by the next year, and actually ended up being used as leverage, one could argue, against fire survivors who were stuck in this bankruptcy process, people like Will.
Yeah, so Governor Newsom faced a really big challenge in trying to figure out what to do after PG&E sought bankruptcy the second time. It jeopardized a lot. There was questions about whether some of those early contracts for wind and solar power could potentially be up for debate or cancellation as part of the bankruptcy. The PG&E's bankruptcy, to some reason, there was concern that it would jeopardize the investment grade credit ratings of California's other large utilities because one thing that we should note, I'm sure some people in the room know, but specifically in California, if a utility's power lines ignite a wildfire, it is liable for the damages regardless of whether it was negligent. So PG&E sought bankruptcy protection with an estimated $30 billion in liability costs. There was questions about what this meant for the financial health of the other utilities in the state. So ultimately, the Newsom administration kind of arrived at this construct, this wildfire fund that would help each of the state's large utilities, so PG&E as well as Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric, manage some of those liability costs going forward. It was kind of set up as like an insurance construct. If the company was found negligent, it would have to pay a deductible in order to tap the fund, but if it wasn't, it would be able to draw from the fund without a reimbursement requirement. But there was a catch for PG&E. In order to access the wildfire fund, which was critical to stabilizing the financial health of the utility coming out of bankruptcy, it had to get approval of that restructuring plan by June 30th of 2020. And so that created a really, really, really challenging deadline for everybody working through this complicated restructuring. Layer in the fact that you had a lot of very savvy financial interests competing for different parts of the pie, so to speak, as the company was restructured. I think that it was very consequential because, as we'll discuss more, fire victims there was a settlement that was arrived at for fire victims that was really unsatisfactory, to say the least, and ultimately the deadline was the deadline at the end of the day.
Will has thoughts on AB 1054. You were actually in the legislature, in the state capitol. I was there too, and I don't cover politics very much, but I was like, wow, this is how the sausage gets made. My goodness, it was really stunning to see the speed at which that legislation was passed. I remember it well. There were changes made on something like a Thursday or a Friday. Everyone goes home for July 4th holiday weekend. And you have legislators actually sitting in this hearing saying, I haven't had time to read this. What is the big rush? Editorials in newspapers saying, can we kind of slow this down a little bit and really process what's in this bill? Will was one of maybe 5 people out. There was a huge line out the door to people in support of 1054, and then there was like 5 people, and you were one of them. Why did you make the drive to Sacramento that day, and what was your concern about the legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I saw drafts of the legislation. I was really concerned and wanted to see where I could contribute to try to make the legislation better. And so met with some of the authors of the bill, tried to engage to affect the legislation, and was really concerned that this was headed in the wrong direction. And I think part of the reason is because when we think about corporate governance, right, we have decisions being made where we have different stakeholders within a corporation at the table. So we've got our financial discussion while we're having our marketing discussion or our safety discussion, and there's a realization within a corporation that these things need to go hand in hand. And what you've sort of heard is that sort of the government response in a large way from AB 1054 was to divide these things up. So how are we going to have a conversation and make progress on safety without thinking about what's going on the financial side? How are these things going to come together so that we have incentive structures that are unified, where we have a unified strategy going forward? And within a corporation, that's a lot easier to do, right? Because the bottom line's the bottom line. You get stakeholders around a table, and that's where you're headed. For government, for nonprofits in a different way, that's a different calculation. So it's a harder thing to do. But for AB 1054, what I saw was that there was going to be this diffusion of responsibility where we weren't sure who really had what. And part of the challenges I think that we face now coming out of that legislation are how do we now unify around incentive structures, right? So how do we make sure that the corporate investors and the investor-owned utilities have the right incentives to be able to move forward that's going to be towards their benefit in terms of their financial situation, but also benefits the public. And so is that performance-based regulation? Is that incentive tied to the investment structures? And so looking at all of those things, I was really concerned AB 1054 was headed in the wrong direction. And now I think the balance or the scale, if you will, sort of tipped very much in favor of investors. And I would just say that my view of the AB 1054 going in was this was very much driven by and for investors. And I think that was very unfortunate.
Michael, how did the passage, I mean, even the discussion before the passage of AB 1054 strike you from where you were sitting?
So let's own a little bit of our own history here, which is that the reason why you have utilities, and particularly monopoly utilities, is that they're able to mobilize capital, private capital, and they're able to scale really fast. That's why they used the regulated investor-owned utilities as the driving edge of our clean energy goals. They invested a lot of money, not in things that they owned, but in contracts that they paid for up front to be able to get all these new technologies deployed across the state of California. And that's a history that goes back to the railroads, where having monopoly railroads had the ability to build an infrastructure that made the state of California an agricultural breadbasket for the rest of the world. So there's value there that people are afraid to abandon, to the extent that when the CPUC makes decisions, for example, a fine, as we did for PG&E, we have to look at what level does that fine, that penalty, actually cause investors to raise their risk price to the California utilities. So all these things get balanced into every action that takes place at the CPUC and every task that we give to the electric, the water, and the gas utilities. So all of us here are beneficiaries of that core design. Nobody really wants to abandon it, particularly not in midstream, but it may not necessarily address all of our goals. It tends to address the goal that the legislature, the governor, and then the CPU assigned to those utilities. If safety is being de-emphasized, if it's assumed that the things we were doing for the past 100 years are not things that we should invest in, you're not going to get safety. So here, we're sort of at the point where there's a huge investment in safety, but I'm going to argue at some point that it's starving other safety programs that are going to turn around to bite us.
You didn't answer my question.
Sorry.
Thumbs up, thumbs down on 1054.
So
I'm just
again, the core thing is that the legislature didn't want to abandon the monopoly utility model yet, so they had to prop it up.
Okay.
It was a get-out-of-town tactic.
Yeah, even though there were a lot of different corners where you saw people clamoring for the co-op model, the public ownership model, those didn't gain much traction.
They have a deadline. It was get out of town.
Yeah. Well, you talked about safety, and Katherine, you know, the book really does a great job of explaining how this was sort of death by 1,000 cuts, right? I mean, we spend a lot of time in journalism, not to knock journalists, love my journalists, but, you know, we look for narratives, right? And so it's always like, okay, this fire happened, what caused that? Mm-hmm. You know, was it one event, one bad decision made by an executive? And I think what's so valuable about your reporting is you go way, way, way back in history. Talk about, kind of the culture aspect of PG&E, where you have these incremental decisions being made over time that ultimately land you in a place where inspections are, a far cry from where they started.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. I mean, I think after these disasters, everyone, not just journalists, is kind of asking who's to blame. And in the case of PG&E, I kind of say, it's no one and also everyone. Everyone within the company had some role to play, but very few kind of had all of the knowledge necessary to know how their decision making played into what ultimately happened. It's generally, I think, understood within the company at this point that sometime maybe around the 80s or the 90s, you did see a shift in the culture. And it didn't happen overnight, but it kind of transformed from a utility that was largely run by engineers, sort of had the very old school utility mindset, and kind of changed into a company that was more financially motivated, and that evolved over time. It was maybe started slowly and then began to accelerate after the push to deregulate the utility industry. We can have a discussion about deregulation. This is not the fault of deregulation. The company sought bankruptcy protection, and as I mentioned earlier, was very keen on reestablishing itself on Wall Street after it emerged in 2004. And it should probably be stated that utilities, they make money by making large capital investments that improve the overall value of their system. They do not make money on day-to-day operations and maintenance expenses like replacing tiny components on transmission towers that are vulnerable to failure. That's just an expense. It's $1 out the door. And so what you saw over time is that as PG&E was sort of hitting different points of challenge, any utility has to strike this balance, right? In terms of how much money is available to invest as capital, how much money is available for operations and maintenance expenses, how do you strike the right balance between delivering to Wall Street and being able to, as Michael mentioned earlier, have the necessary access to capital to keep the system running, to raise more money, to build more things, whatever it may be, and also not doing the appropriate amount to maintain what you have already. And PG&E at various points in time started to just scale back a little bit. I'm going to use, I think it's telling to use the transmission line that failed and ignited the campfire as an example. So I think in the 80s, if I remember correctly, that line was, inspectors would walk beneath it 3 times a year. It would be flown once, and 5% of the towers would be climbed each year so that the inspectors could look at these tiny pieces of equipment at close range. And then I think in the run-up to deregulation in the 90s, that was scaled back to maybe 1 ground inspection, 1 helicopter inspection, and then at some point, climbing within was no longer routinely required. So it's just these decisions in which I think that the person who's making it is faced with this question of like, okay, I have finite resources, I have kind of almost 2 competing sets of interests. How do I thread the needle? I can take just a little bit of money from that operations and maintenance budget, shift it over to expense. There's no immediate consequence. And it's not that different than what we were doing before. But I think what that person may fail to recognize is like you're getting pretty far from the baseline. What was originally done years ago, way before that person joined the company. And it's kind of a long-winded answer of saying that like there's a vast diffusion of responsibility within this company. There's directives come down from the top. People in the middle have to sort of make these difficult decisions, and no one person making the decisions necessarily understands how their choice to cut that corner just a little bit affects the rest of the organization, the overall health of the infrastructure, the amount of knowledge that's collected and used appropriately to assess risk. And so it's really complicated, but it's kind of necessary in understanding how, because it's a story ultimately of systemic breakdown, right? It's a story of systemic breakdown, and that's kind of how that happens. I'll just, as a quick aside, and I'll end it, my response to this, but the company, interestingly, has been twice convicted on charges of failing to safely maintain its infrastructure, but in neither case were prosecutors able to bring charges against any one individual. And it's not an intuitive idea, but it's kind of important to understand when thinking about this holistically.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you often hear from people is like, why didn't anyone go to jail?
Right.
I hear that all the time when talking about this story, not just about PG&E, but just corporate malfeasance in general. And I think the answer is, well, these decisions were made over such a long period of time. You can't go back and convict somebody who didn't do the inspection right in the 1970s, or the person who whittled away at the procedure that 2 decades later. And so it just becomes really complicated. And I'm struck by how it's fallen to these very understaffed and underfunded local prosecutors to bring about accountability. And because of the Butte County experience, bringing forth a very solid case, 85 indictments to which PG&E ultimately pleaded guilty, 84 of which were involuntary manslaughter charges, you get a $3.5 million fine. That's it. And so it's sort of, I think, inciting some of these prosecutors on other cases to say maybe we should go the civil route instead of pursuing this criminal approach. Will, I want to ask you about, stepping back. There was a day, it was a Tuesday, I remember this. There was a bankruptcy hearing, and there was also the day that you had Bill Johnson pleading guilty on behalf of the company, not individually, in Butte County Court, pleading guilty to those 85 charges that I just talked about. And then he was gone. A couple weeks later, he left the company just a couple, maybe weeks later. You were in court that day, making sort of your last one of your last arguments against the bankruptcy. I wonder, what was it like for you being in that space? You're in front of a bankruptcy judge. You're surrounded by these. We were all on Zoom at that point. It was the pandemic. You're surrounded by these lawyers who didn't want you there. You were never really welcomed in that space, and yet you kept going back. And I think one of the things that was striking to me about your involvement on the bankruptcy side was you really thought that the bankruptcy could be an opportunity to change, right? So tell me about that day. I can't remember the exact argument you were making that day, but at that point, did you feel defeated? How did you process all that was going on that day?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was really a moment that brought home to me how there were these disconnects that really needed to be connected, right? We had, on the one hand, all of these charges and guilty charges coming forward, and we had a bankruptcy where we had a confirmed plan that didn't address any of the things that led to these criminal convictions. And prior to the bankruptcy, a lot of what was pointed to in discussions at the Public Utilities Commission was, okay, now that the bankruptcy has started, here's a process for restructuring, right? So a corporation's going to be restructured. And so for me, I looked at that as an opportunity to engage, to think about how a corporation can restructure to address their risks, which are the same risks that I have as a homeowner, right, with making sure that we're addressing wildfire mitigation. So it was an opportunity, but unfortunately, part of what I was surprised about within the bankruptcy is that really a lot of the discussion was around the dollars, right? And unfortunately, there were things put in place where the dollars really were the focus on everything, and there was no discussion on safety at all. And the response from Judge Montali in the bankruptcy court was, well, the Public Utilities Commission will take care of that, right? And then when there was a discussion at the Public Utilities Commission, where I went there, they said, oh, well, that's something that the bankruptcy court will take, right? So there was a lot of this pointing at different organizations about who had what, and definitely it was a source of frustration, but trying to look at this as really an opportunity to come together. and trying to see how we could bring these things together so that we could have a successful corporation, successful investors who are making a good return, while having all of those investments aligned towards safety. And how do we get that done? And what does that mean for corporate governance? What does that mean for the regulator? What does that mean for the homeowner? And trying to make, as much as I can, advocating for alignment of those incentives.
I mean, coming back to 1054, because at that point in the bankruptcy, this is June 2020, very, like the last few weeks, really, you keep hearing AB 1054 invoked by the lawyers as in, we have to get this done. We don't have time to go over the details, including some really critical details that would later affect these tens of thousands of wildfire victims like Will in terms of the way that they were, going to get compensated, which was part stock, which at that point was tanking, and it wasn't a pretty picture. And because we keep talking about 1054, partly that's my fault, but Michael, I wonder from you, what was the interface between the CPUC and the legislature while that legislation was being discussed? And how do you think of it looking back? I mean, is this, I know it's over, it's on the books now, but I mean, I think it's kind of surprising for some people like myself who don't cover politics often that, there didn't seem to be a lot of thought or maybe a lot of reflection before it passed. And so I just wonder how that, how do these two organs of our government work together? Do they work together, or does one sort of supersede the other when it comes down to it?
We obey the law, which is adopted by the legislature and signed by the governor. We'll sometimes interact with the legislature, but there were limits to how much they wanted to deal with us.
So you can't really exert a ton of influence, is that what you're saying?
We have a very effective legislative advocate, but on some questions, that's not the point. This was about getting the financial system comfortable with the utilities who provide services in California and make sure that there was stability in electricity service and the other things that the utilities do. That's my view. And so a lot of things that I probably pointed out just didn't fit within that set of objectives. So all the larger questions are still there.
I wonder what regrets you have, because you have talked in the past about how, looking back, you didn't love the job. What regrets do you have? What would you have done differently?
Well, I had this conversation with Will, is that the job of a commissioner is to balance things, to look at the evidence that's presented in a hearing. We're sort of a judicial body, specialty stuff like tax courts or the admiralty courts or patent courts. But that's the processes we use. It's not one of the modern regulatory frameworks. And so you have to make your decision based on evidence that's presented in a very formal setting. So you balance a lot. And so I talked about the fact that on the PG&E San Bruno penalty, there's two phases. We found that they were imprudent. That's not a justice issue. That's an economic issue. They were imprudent because they are the people who vouchsafe investor dollars. They failed to do that. Second thing is, what do you do to not punish them, but to make them better? And we came up with what at the time was the largest financial penalty for a utility in the United States ever.
Was it the $2 billion?
Yeah, it was, when you add some of the stuff that came before, it was a total of about $2.6 billion. The stock market didn't move at all. The owners didn't care. And
why do you think that is?
And what does it mean in terms of accountability if $2.5 billion isn't going to move the share price a bit and people aren't selling or buying because they see an opportunity to improve the property? What does that mean? So for me, it became a different question, because the same case, I saw an instance where a line supervisor driving down the freeway on his way home heard about it on the radio, turned around, went back and broke into a storage locker, not in his beat, but he knew what he needed to go shut off the gas, and he did that. How do you instill that within one of these large organizations? Why did they have that at one point, but they didn't at other points? How do you begin to motivate that? So at the time that we made that penalty, we started this process of trying to figure out what is a safety culture. That was the workshop that you came to. We brought Phil Johnson in to answer questions about how he saw the utility building that muscle memory on what you do to improve safety. Because it was there, then it was gone. How do you bring it back? If your owners aren't going to do it, can we do it? And I think that there's no answer to that yet. I don't have an answer. I continue to worry about it. That would probably be good research projects for people who are thinking about sustainability and corporate accountability. What are the models where you can, from outside, bring about a safety culture in a large institution? I knew what I had to do at the CPUC. We got our gas safety division, in the words of the head of the Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration at the federal government, from being the worst state program to the best state program. But I don't know how to do that from outside.
I often find that inverse condemnation is invoked a certain way in this story as like, kind of like an anvil. You just like drop it into the conversation. It's like, well, we can't do anything about that. It's like, I love your reflections on inverse condemnation. I mean, 1054 seemed to, in some ways, defang inverse condemnation effectively, although it's not often framed in that way. Would love your thoughts. Do you want to start? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I think that, so inverse condemnation is important, and I think what AB 1054 did was exactly that, was really to make sure that now it was the responsibility for others, and in some cases interveners at the Public Utilities Commission, to now have to demonstrate whether a utility acted reasonably or not, rather than the utility having to demonstrate when a fire is started that they were in fact reasonable or not reasonable. And when you think about that, corporation and all their resources and all that they can bring to bear to be able to demonstrate reasonableness, and now Will, an intervener at the Public Utilities Commission, is now the person who needs to explain whether a utility acted reasonable or not, caravine down into the Feather River Canyon to somehow put on my inspector hat to see if they were reasonable or not. And that's a lot of what AB 1054 did, was it put the burden on people who didn't have the resources to now have to prove whether a utility acted reasonable or not. And this is the predicament that we're in now, and we've got to figure out what to do about it, because certainly we understand that without accountability, we're going to have more fires. And so it is something that I'm really concerned about, that we got to figure out how we address in the regulatory space, in the legislative space, and elsewhere.
Do you want to say anything additional to that, just about inverse condemnation? Can anything be done about it? Should anything be done about it? I mean, you often hear it referred to as like, it just makes being a California utility impossible, and you throw our hands up in the air.
So I think this is, again, in my mind, a larger question on the history. Inverse condemnation was a court-made rule to get victims compensated. It originally came out of flood control, and it was a case that was a public agency that built levees to protect farmlands, and they caused the flood to go onto properties on the other side of the river. That was basically the strategy back then. You built your levee higher than the other side, and they flooded first and took the pressure off your levee. And so the court said, wait a minute, we can't sort this out. This is too complicated for us. We are going to create this policy called inverse condemnation. You caused it, you pay for it, then you collect from your owners. And so that became the rule by which all entities that are defined as utility under California law have to do this. The specialty court that figures out whether it's going to be ratepayers or not, it happens in this case to be the CPUC. Elsewhere, it's frequently just paid for. If you're a local government and you do this, for example, the case of a fire that was caused by the Trinity Public Utilities district, the cost of making victims whole for a fire they caused was 3 times their revenues. So the legislature bailed them out. So the question that is stuck in my mind is, if climate change is real, does anybody here think that climate change is not real? And the infrastructure that we have is not built to sustain this, there's going to be a lot of this kind of stuff. And inverse condemnation may have worked up until recently. Is it the right way to make victims whole, to allow people to recover, to reestablish? And are there other rules that we need to put in place? So, I can go into this at great length, but should we allow people to rebuild? Should we just buy them out and they should find a safer place? Well, that may work if you're primarily focused on wildfire, but you might end up moving into a floodplain, and don't get me started on levees. So I don't have an answer to this. All I know is that we're going to regret not having this larger conversation.
I'll just add, in some remarks that we've been talking about, AB 1054 is kind of like, it was a move to preserve and stabilize the investor-owned utility model. Inverse condemnation applies under any ownership model in California. It's not just the IOUs. If PG&E was a co-op, it would be the same. If PG&E was owned by the state, it would be the same. And so, in the case of an investor-owned utility like PG&E, there is a real case for keeping these companies financially healthy. They do need access to capital to make the kinds of investments that we're talking about, that is going to be able to reorient the infrastructure to be safer and more resilient as we move into this more uncertain future. The flip side is, PG&E did incur roughly $30 billion in liability costs. It did seek bankruptcy protection to deal with it. And the financial vultures, so to speak, descended, and PG&E did not emerge financially healthier. So there's a lot to balance.
And PG&E is a screw-up.
And yes.
It's one of the few bankruptcies, I don't know if there is another one where they actually have more debt after the bankruptcy than where they started, which was already fairly, indebted.
Yeah, and I should have added, the restructuring was really complicated, of course. There's only so much you can do under certain, within certain confines. And there was just a great deal of challenges. But yes, it emerged with more debt. It has very serious constraints right now in its ability to raise the capital that it needs to do the sort of work that we're talking about, and something that, a lot of very smart people are trying to actively grapple with as we speak.
I'm going to open up to questions at this point. Thank you guys so much for dealing with my questions. And if you guys have anything, just raise your hand, and we're going to ask you to stand up if you have questions. Just introduce yourself and then ask your question, and we will field it here. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Manshi Desai. I am one of the students in Professor Weissman's class studying energy law. My question is that what is the biggest change that you feel needs to be in terms of regulations to make sure that this mistake doesn't happen again?
Great question.
Would like to start, Michael?
If you want to talk about electric risk, I would say that at the highest level, this duty to serve all customers should be wiped out, and we should set criteria as to which customers can be served. If you live in a hazardous or an extremely hazardous area, you should no longer have service from an electric utility. The insurance industry is basically applying that. They are canceling insurance policies in these communities that are at high fire hazard risk, or raising the rates prohibitively, and people are going without insurance. Should we look at their pricing model? That's not a very appealing one, and the legislature just kind of stared at me when I suggested that. That was not something that they suggested. Alternatively, we could create a series of different models where you have a very decentralized process, but it doesn't remove the risk. It just shifts it around. So I lectured at UCLA at one point, and I shared office with this guy, Mike Davis. If you've never read his books, City of Courts or The Ecology of Fear, they are very central to these kinds of questions, but particularly Ecology of Fear. He wrote a chapter called the case for letting Malibu burn, because they had so many wildfires and we just kept allowing them to rebuild. Some of them were caused by electric infrastructure failures. Some of them were caused by telecommunications infrastructure that failed and caused the electric infrastructure to fail. But the electric infrastructure companies were the ones who paid it, and then they recovered from the telecommunications. That's inverse condemnation. I think we need to have that conversation. Are we willing to go that far? If not, what is the solution to building infrastructure that we know is going to continue to have some risk associated with it to serve some portion of the population, and knowing that people who don't cause that particular portion of the risk are going to have to pay for it? That's a brutal answer. But I actually spoke that as the president of the commission of the California legislature. And as I knew that it was likely, and as you might all guess, they went, yeah, let's change the subject.
Just, I guess two things for me I think really stand out. One is strategic integration. One thing that gives me a great source of consternation is that we have scattered strategies on how to deal with these things. And by and large, the same strategies that are going to help to address wildfire mitigation in my home are the same strategies that PG&E needs to make around their infrastructure. And yet we have community wildfire protection plans that are out in various municipalities that are completely disconnected from the utility wildfire mitigation plans, which are their strategy documents. They don't talk to each other. We have other state strategies to address these things that are completely disconnected from all of those strategies. And so given that the strategies are disconnected, the tactics are also disconnected and all over the place and not aligned. And that's not a good recipe for how we're moving forward. And then the other area where I think there needs to be some improvement is really around the incentive structure. We have to align the investor incentives with our challenges ahead around climate and wildfire risk mitigation. We got to get there. We can't keep those disconnected. And the status quo is a huge driver. And the investors, by and large, want the status quo. Do whatever you want with safety. Do whatever you want with climate, as long as I keep getting my return, right? And that we can't have that happen and have a positive direction forward. So we got to get those things aligned through legislation, regulation, and how we're operating within our communities. So those would be sort of my two areas of improvement.
So when Katherine asked the question in her book, can you do it all? I mean, the utilities did get alignment and incentive to really decarbonize the electric grid. The electric industry is only 15% of our carbon budget these days. Transportation, 40%. Can you do that all in the same entities?
And I it's easy for me from the outside, right? But I think you can, and I think part of what is an illustration of the disconnect with that is, yes, we have these great carbon goals, but we have these huge wildfires that are putting all this carbon in the atmosphere that have nothing to do with those carbon goals. So we have to have the goals aligned too. We can't have that happen. We have to have the wildfires that are contributing carbon count on the negative side of that scale. So the goals have to be aligned, the tactic, all of this needs to be aligned. And I know it's much, much more difficult to do in a government space than it is within a corporate space. But I'm afraid I think that's the challenges that we have.
Okay, well, I'm just going to push something else into it, which is California is spending a lot of dollars to actually try to reduce that wildfire risk. We may not be doing it in a very good fashion, but there's another dimension. You cannot find a forester to go and actually look at the problem in utility space in Oregon because they're all in California. Talking to folks in Montana, there's not a forester left in the state except on 3-day weekends. They're all in California. There's not enough electrical engineers to be able to supply that. So there's a whole realm of within this universe of discourse that stands entirely outside of the discussion. Any electrical engineers here? Okay.
But isn't that, I guess a question for me would be, isn't that resource constraint that you just described the reason why we have to align those goals? Because then we can share resources around the same goals as opposed to...
All I'm saying is that the conversation is so focused on very specific aspects that we may be missing the larger question that we have to answer to be able to address the lack of coherence and consistency that you usually. I'm not opposed to that. I'm just saying that there's a larger dimension of issues that we got to deal with.
Thank you very much for that terrific question. Any others for here?
Yeah, let's bring in
Can you stand up for us? Because we're actually videotaping this, so stand up and
yeah,
tell us
bringing
your
in
name.
a couple of questions from the Zoom chat. So I'm Cooper, I'm a second-year MBA student here. Bringing in a couple questions from the Zoom chat. So these are both related to corporate governance, so I think we'll kind of bundle these and let the whole panel take a shot at them. The first one comes from Ann Simpson, who asks, the corporate governance question is key. Can a public utility be investor-owned and serve stakeholders' needs as well as investor expectations? Is the SMUD model, meaning municipalization, better for squaring the circle? And then the second one comes from Chris, who says, the current relationship between communities and corporate management is not compatible with climate change and sustainability. How can we reimagine and redesign our systems to meet the demands of a changing climate when the foundation of our systems is comprised of old infrastructure, old financial institutions, and old thinking controlled by boardrooms of old people, typically of one gender and color? So I'll leave it for the panel on corporate governance, municipalization, and then diversity on corporate boards, I think, are the two core issues getting answered that.
Municipalization, Michael, I know you have many thoughts.
So I actually served on the board of a municipally owned utility, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District in Sacramento. So in 1988, SMUD owned a nuclear power plant and had consecutive failures in the turbine and never really was able to operate it financially sound. It split the community apart. There were 3 separate boards in a 2-year period, 6 different general managers. Rates went up 300%. I got to say, public utilities are not always a perfect model. You can look at the corruption in the IID and, frankly, the San Francisco PUC. I don't know that is a perfect answer. SMUD turned it around. It's now one of the most respected utilities in the state of California. And that came from really good leadership. So I would say that that is something that stands above this question of design of public or private. Sacramento did not deal well with this question. There was a circulation petitioning in Sacramento in 1987, 88 to actually turn the utility back over to PG&E.
Yes. Which it took 23 years to peel itself away from between the 20s and the 40s.
So I'm a fan of public utilities. I'm just saying that this is sort of a ideological answer and not a practical answer.
Mm-hmm. Having said that, briefly, when we have these big wildfire threats every year, I don't often see things like power shutoffs at SMUD. I don't know if they even do them.
So I'll just give the example of Portland General Electric, which is a company that I've been working with in Oregon. They did not, there's no rule there was no rule in Labor Day of 2020 for PSPS. They had a very, very, very good new meteorologist. He said, we got a problem. We got a real big problem. It's going to hit this day. They actually did forced outages, and they got thank you letters. California is outage averse. I think the history of San Diego, which did not do outages in the Witch-Wahito and Rice fires because they didn't want to turn off the power on street lights in evacuation areas, and we found that they were imprudent for that. They did after a while. They got very scientific about it, and they actually digitized the landscape behind the city and the county in that one mountain range behind them. They have more situational awareness than the National Weather Service, to the point that now the Navy and the FAA use their data as opposed to the National Weather Service for wind speeds as you're making aerial approaches to Miramar or any of the other airports. That's a very small landscape, however, and they spent $1.5 billion. They started with some fairly big outages, but as they started to learn, it shrunk. PG&E has done the same.
Yeah, it started very broad.
Very broad.
A lot of heat for that in 2019. You had something you wanted to say, right?
Oh, I mean, I think that the ownership question inevitably comes up after these disasters like we have. And there's sort of like an ideological discussion to have. There's also a practical reality to contend with of like actually changing the IOU model at this point would be very challenging. But to the extent that there's discussion about actually changing it, it raises a lot of questions. So of course this discussion stems from the idea, should the profit motive be removed? Can an investor-owned utility properly thread the needle between satisfying private interests and serving the public good? PG&E historically has failed to do this well. And I mean, there's something to be said for removing the profit motive, but let's say, PG&E, an enormous utility serving 15 million people with a service territory covering 70,000 square miles, is suddenly owned by the state. It requires an enormous amount of state resources, right? I mean, that's a really, really expensive proposition. And who are you going to get to run the utility? It's probably a lot of the same people who run it now. And so, or you just operate it, make decisions, look at the lines. And so, the utility becomes entirely reliant on the debt market or taxpayer dollars, and you still have inverse condemnation to contend with when inevitable accidents happen. So there's no perfect solution from an ownership standpoint, in my view. And any sort of model that you look at has benefits, but it also has drawbacks that need to be contended with.
For me, I think the municipalization and public models or ratepayer models has to do with what you're trying to tackle. So I think first question, what are the goals? What's the strategy? And then figure out the owner. And part of what I perceived in terms of the legislative debate between Golden State Energy, a public model, or keep going with PG&E, was there wasn't a clear goal for either of those models. And so if you switch and go to Golden State model, a public model, how does that look? Okay, what does that look like? We want to underground lines. Are we going to take a vote? That's going to increase rates by X amount. Is everything going to be a ballot measure? And regardless of the model, as Katherine was saying, regardless of the model, you still have to, there's well-run public models, there's poorly run public models, there's well-run corporate models, there are poorly run corporate models, and at the end of the day, I think it has to do with the goals and the strategy you're trying to achieve.
There was a second question.
Question about corporate board diversity and making sure that corporate boards like PG&E and those of other companies sort of reflect the interests and represent the communities that they're serving.
That's a really good question, and early in the bankruptcy in 2019, what you saw was, I think it was Governor Newsom calling for a cleaning of house on the entire board, like get rid of it, bring in all new people, and we've seen so much turnover in the C-suite as well. Anybody want to tackle that?
It is interesting that historically the board of PG&E, the people who oversaw the utility through a lot of this, a lot of them were in place for a lot of years. And the board, historically speaking, hasn't gotten a huge amount of scrutiny. I mean, there's been some litigation, of course, but in general, it's not something that I think the general public is thinking a great deal about, and it's a really good question. And then after the seeking bankruptcy protection in 2019, the company did ultimately put in a mostly new board. A lot of them were people who were used to dealing with really complex restructurings. And so now, for the first time in a long time, I think you have a mostly new board that's actually trying to be more active in thinking about risk. But it's certainly not something that you saw historically. And I think that that's a really valid criticism to levy, that the board had a big role to play and ultimately really didn't. As some of these risks were emerging, they probably weren't nearly as engaged as they needed to be. We'll see with this new board, what they're able to affect and think about. And I think in some of the conversations I have, there are strong indications that they're much more engaged on this.
I think we have time. Oh, did you want to say something? We have time for one more question, if you want to add to that. Okay, right there.
I'm Debbie. I live near the area. We have lived next to a pipeline that has been exposed since 1980, and it took us about 12 years to finally get PG&E to fix that section of the pipeline. So we bore witness to all of the behavior described in Katherine's book, and certainly empathize. We were trying to avoid, losing our property, avoid dying. So we were fortunate enough to be able to do this, but it's been an ongoing saga. And when I think about the different motivations and the different ways to try to implement safety culture, is how do you get, when something is a monopoly, right? Like as a consumer, if I don't like this product, I can buy a different product. And then the different companies have to compete and be better for me. Otherwise, I just won't shop there. But PG&E is able to not do that. And so is there any viable alternative as us as consumers? Is there anything on the horizon that we can do to force competition? Because the CPUC, as Michael has said, not sure what role they play in safety. There's a safety culture. There's expenses relating maintenance and repairs, all of which we saw. There's a disregard for public safety, which we see as well. But I, as a consumer, would love to make the choice to not have to use PG&E. Is there anything on the horizon?
So there's currently right now, there's a safety culture proceeding at the Public Utilities Commission that has been changed and expanding. The safety culture proceeding is now been directed by AB 1054, which said you now have to go assess safety culture. And this has been bantied about for a very long time. And I would argue that largely that's an impossible task. I mean, what is it that's a culture? Are we going to start to now read minds within a corporation to understand, are they really thinking about safety? And what that has been for PG&E is you call a PG&E number, and they have on their voicemail, hello, are you thinking about safety? Every meeting they start, they say, they have a safety announcement, and that de facto means that, oh, okay, we must have a safety culture, and that's not the case. I would say that, part of what this should be is, there's that expression, don't tell me what your values are, show me your budget. And I think similarly for the corporations, that's where the focus needs to be. Show me that your incentives are aligned with safety. And then I'll know you have a safety culture, because your point is well taken, that in a competitive environment, you have to compete on these things to survive. And so what are the things that we can put in place? And this is, of course, where the regulator is situated. What are the things that we can put in place that are a proxy for those things that are in a competitive environment for these monopolies to help them and to motivate them to keep striving? And that, I think, is the challenge.
Go ahead, Katherine.
No, are we done?
We're kind of running out of time, but I'd love your final thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, it's a really tough question, because I think that it's hard to even imagine, frankly, what competition would look like when we're talking about. I mean, your point about the gas line is well taken, but I think kind of zooming out and thinking about the infrastructure system broadly, whether that be the gas system or the electric system, what competition even looks like there. Because if you think about Texas, which is sort of like, it's the most competitive energy market in the country, but what you have is you have people competing to generate power and sell it to people who buy it wholesale and distribute it to the customers. You still have the same sort of utility like PG&E, one tasked with maintaining the infrastructure itself. Like, there's no competition in that middle space, And so really the only thing I think that, at least I'd be curious if I miss anything, but really one of the only options is to kind of take it inward, have rooftop solar or some sort of microgrid configuration in which you're buying less power from the utility. This raises all kinds of difficult questions about overall operation of the system, but I don't know how you seed competition to maintain the infrastructure that we have now. It's such a tough question.
There's lots of places where we don't have choice, and things aren't working, and you can't buy a better governor. You're kind of stuck with the one you got. So I'm not going to suggest that you not stand your ground. This is something I wrestled with and something Maribel wrestled with. So I kind of reached the point where I think that you can have a safety culture. I don't think that talking about it is enough. You do have to put budget. You have to hire people. You have to hire the right people. You have to make sure that they're doing a good job and hold them accountable. Who's going to provide that leadership? So that's why we're having this discussion about corporate governance. What is the leadership model? How do we have an interaction at? There's a wealth of literature on that. But if it fails and the shareholders aren't willing to go find the right people to protect their investment and to protect the public, they're willing to just deal with the fines, what do you do? And so I was at the point in the safety culture proceeding where we were going to declare that people do not have an entitlement as a monopoly. This is a franchise the state of California has offered to people. And so because the CPUC has a process, it took us 3 years to get people to come forward to say that you can treat it like a franchise. And if they don't do a good job, you don't have to wait for the owners to do it. You can revoke the franchise. And so the state eventually settled on a slightly different model, which is rather than setting the basic standard is you're a franchise. If you don't quit screwing up, you're going to lose that franchise. We've sort of done a little bit of a reverse of that, which is that we're going to keep moving down this pipeline, then we're going to revoke it. I would thought you'd say 7 years from now, your franchise is up, you got to prove to us you did a better job, otherwise you can't even bid on that franchise. That to me is a
performance-based
way that
incentives.
you get the investors to pay
Yeah.
attention.
We're going to talk a lot more in the next panel about performance-based incentives and, you know, all kinds of incentive structure related issues. I'm really glad you asked that question to kind of round things out for this panel. Will, Katherine, and Michael, it's been such a pleasure to share this time with you. I hope we should do this more, right?
Thank you for giving
Can we do this more?
me the opportunity to say things you can't say as a commissioner at the CPUC.